Hey, welcome. I know, midweek can feel kind of heavy sometimes, right? Maybe you're already a little worn out from the week, and that's okay. Take a breath, settle in, and just let yourself relax for a bit. We're going to dive into a story tonight that's full of twists, lessons, and some real human moments. So grab a comfy spot, maybe a cup of something warm, and let's walk through this together slowly, casually, and just seeing what we can learn along the way. So let's jump into this part of David's story. And oh boy, it's a real roller coaster. David at this point is on the run from King Saul. And if you remember, Saul is not just a little annoyed at David, he's downright jealous, insecure, and, well, honestly, a little unstable. He's been trying to kill David multiple times, so David's life is pretty much a constant game of hide and seek, except, with actual life or death stakes. And while David is trusting the Lord, he's also smart enough to know that trusting God doesn't mean standing in front of a moving bus, right? So he's moving, hiding, and constantly seeking guidance. Now, during this crazy wilderness period, David has this small, ragtag army following him. These aren't professional soldiers or anything. They're basically loyal companions who've stuck with him through all this mess. And they've been doing something pretty interesting. They've been guarding the flocks of this wealthy guy named Nabal. And here's the thing, they're not charging him anything. They're just helping because it's the right thing to do. And David's army isn't exactly rolling in money at this point. So David thinks, well, it's kind of standard courtesy, right? If someone benefits from your generosity, it's nice to get a little return. So he decides to send some of his men to Nabal to politely, ask for some provisions. David and his guys literally have nothing but the clothes on their backs and maybe a couple of supplies. He's not asking for a full feast or anything extravagant, just enough to show a little gratitude and keep the peace. It's really humble when you think about it. So, his messengers go to Nabal and politely as they can say something like, "Hey, we've been taking care of your flocks for nothing. How about helping us out a little? Whatever seems fair to you. We're not trying to pressure you." And oh man, Nabal's reaction. Totally dismissive, he's like, "David, who David, the son of Jesse? Who even is that?" It's wild because by this point everyone knows David's name. The guy defeated Goliath. His reputation is huge, but Nabal, for reasons that are, well, you kind of have to call it arrogance or just plain foolishness, totally ignores this. So the messengers head back to David with the bad news. And David, understandably, is pretty fired up. He's already dealing with this constant threat from Saul, and now this rich guy refuses to show even basic decency. David tells his men to strap on their swords. He's like, "All right, boys, looks like we're gonna have to go visit Nabal ourselves." And yeah, you can imagine the tension building here. They're heading to confront a man who's not just rude, but dangerous if pushed too far. It's a tense setup right now. Here's where Abigail comes in, and she's honestly the hero of this little episode. Abigail is Nabal's wife. And let me just say, she is clever, composed, and frankly, way smarter than her husband in this scenario. She somehow gets wind of what's about to happen David's army. Angered and ready for action, and she doesn't just sit there, she takes immediate action. Instead of waiting for disaster, she gathers a generous supply of food and wine, gets on her donkey, and rides out to intercept David herself. And she does this alone, which, okay, if you think about it, is pretty gutsy. Abigail meets David on the road, and this is where her wisdom really shines. She doesn't start with blame or lecture. She's calm, she's measured, and she speaks directly to David's anger, addressing it but also redirecting it. She essentially says, "Hey, I know your heart is right, and I know you could be justified in being angry, but let me prevent bloodshed. Please accept these gifts and calm your heart." And here's a little side note, there's this proverb, right? Proverbs 15:1, about a soft answer turning away wrath. Abigail is basically living that proverb in real time. She's walking the walk. And it works. David sees the wisdom in her actions, the humility, and honestly, the bravery. He accepts her gifts and lets go of the violence he had been ready to unleash. Meanwhile, Abigail goes back to Nabal, who, by the way, is completely clueless. He doesn't realize the near disaster he's narrowly avoided. And when she tells him what she's done, basically, how she saved his life from David's army, the Bible says Nabal's heart froze. Now, that's kind of dramatic language, right? It probably means he had a heart attack, or at least that he was completely stunned by the reality of what could have happened. It's one of those moments where you just pause and think, yeah, she literally prevented a massacre. Without her, there's no telling what David's army might have done in a rage. And as it turns out, Nabal doesn't recover. A few days later, he dies. The text doesn't leave much ambiguity about it, and David's army is no longer in danger of a confrontation with him. Now, here's the interesting part about David and Abigail. After Nabal dies, David essentially takes Abigail as his wife. And it's important to note, this isn't just some romantic plot twist, it's also a recognition of her loyalty, wisdom, and character. Abigail is eager to go with David too, because, honestly, she's leaving behind a mean-spirited husband. She's been rescued in a sense, and now she's with someone who respects her and values her judgment. So, yes, this becomes David's third wife at the time. Before Abigail, he had Michal, Saul's daughter, but she's currently separated from him while he's on the run. Then there's Ahinoam of Jezreel, who's also with him now. So the situation with his marriages is a little complicated, but Abigail's addition is clearly about character and mutual respect rather than conquest or impulsive desire. Abigail's intervention is fascinating because it highlights a few things about leadership, wisdom, and the importance of taking decisive, intelligent action in tense situations. She sees the big picture, she understands the potential consequences, and she doesn't wait for someone else to fix it. She steps up, and David, as a leader, responds not just to the immediate danger being diffused, but also to her discernment and courage. It's one of those moments where human intelligence, courage, and moral clarity intersect in a story, and it's really compelling when you read it straight through. Now, going back a little bit, David's situation is key to understanding the tension here. He's not just wandering aimlessly, he's on the run. Exhausted, probably frustrated, and constantly aware that Saul could be anywhere. His men are loyal, yes, but they're weary too. They've been following him for a long time, fighting small battles, securing areas, guarding flocks, all without a stable base of resources. And then you throw in Nabal's insult, his outright refusal to acknowledge their efforts. And it's understandable that David's initial reaction is anger. This is not just pride, it's practical, survival-based concern. If you don't respect or reward those who protect your resources, you're asking for trouble. Nabal, oblivious as he is, could have triggered a disastrous escalation, but Abigail's wisdom prevents it. Her approach is subtle but brilliant. She doesn't threaten, she doesn't manipulate in a heavy-handed way, and she certainly doesn't provoke David further. She simply appeals to his sense of justice, his faith, and his long-term vision. She essentially says, look, I know you're right to be upset, but let's avoid unnecessary bloodshed. Let's resolve this without violence. And in doing so, you preserve your integrity. David's reaction shows he's receptive to reason and wisdom when it's delivered thoughtfully. And it's an important reminder in leadership stories that anger is powerful, but guided wisdom can channel it toward better outcomes. And then, of course, there's the practical side. Abigail brings food, wine, and resources to David and his men. This isn't just a token gesture, it's a tangible act that directly addresses the immediate needs of David's group. They're weary, they're hungry, and this action not only prevents bloodshed but also restores morale. There's something deeply human about that moment, the mix of tension, fear, relief, and gratitude all rolled into one, and the narrative really lets us feel that tension and resolution in a way that's immediate and relatable. Once David has accepted Abigail's intervention, he's able to restrain his own anger. He doesn't go after Nabal, doesn't take revenge, and in doing so, he maintains his moral authority. This is crucial because David is building a reputation as a leader who respects the Lord's guidance, even when provoked. This event foreshadows a lot of the ethical and moral decisions David will face later in his life, where restraint, wisdom, and reliance on God's timing will define him as a leader. Meanwhile, Abigail returns home and delivers the news to Nabal. His reaction is, well, the text is dramatic. His heart freezes. It's one of those moments where the story pauses to let you imagine the shock, the fear, and probably a dose of regret too late. And then, of course, a few days later, he dies. It's a stark reminder in the narrative about the consequences of foolishness, arrogance, and ignoring the efforts of those who act justly. And yes, in the same story, David is able to step in and, as we mentioned, marry Abigail. It's both a personal and political move, strengthening his position and aligning himself with someone of discernment and integrity. Abigail's role in this story is, in many ways, pivotal. Without her, there's bloodshed. Without her, David might have compromised his moral position. And without her, the narrative loses a powerful example of courage, foresight, and wisdom. She intervenes not out of self-interest alone, but out of a genuine understanding of justice, human behavior, and divine timing. And David's recognition of her qualities through marriage underscores that wisdom, courage, and discernment are highly valued traits, not just in biblical times, but in any story of leadership and human interaction. So, to recap, David is on the run from Saul, guarding flocks, and managing a small army that's loyal but weary. Nabal, a wealthy but foolish man, refuses to reward their efforts, which nearly triggers a violent confrontation. Abigail, his wise and courageous wife, steps in, intercepts David, calms his wrath, and provides for his men, effectively preventing bloodshed. Nabal dies a few days later, and David, recognizing Abigail's wisdom and bravery, marries her. It's a story that blends strategy, morality, and human emotion beautifully, showing how quick thinking and wisdom can avert disaster and shape destiny. And there's just so much to unpack here about leadership, restraint, and discernment, all wrapped up in this dramatic, real human story that feels as immediate today as it did back then. Alright, let's dive into chapters 24 and 26, and honestly, these are some of the tensest, most human parts of David's story. You've got this guy, David, right on the run from King Saul. Saul is obsessed with killing him, constantly hunting him down, and David's been dodging him for, well, years at this point. It's exhausting just thinking about it. And so, David and his men are in these wilderness areas, moving from place to place, trying to stay one step ahead. It's a life of constant tension, you know, the kind of stress that would get to anyone. So, in chapter 24, there's this earlier episode that really sets the stage for the principle David is living by. David and his men are hiding in a cave, think of it as a tactical hideout, and Saul just happens to walk in there. Now, this is the king of Israel, the guy who's been relentlessly hunting David, and he's completely vulnerable at this moment. He's in the cave, probably thinking he's alone, probably thinking, this is a safe place, I can rest for a bit. And David, with his men behind him, sees the opportunity of a lifetime. I mean, come on. Here's the guy who's trying to kill you. He's literally in your hands. You could end it right here. No risk at all. And yeah, David does something kind of wild. He sneaks up quietly and cuts off a piece of Saul's garment. That's it. Not a fatal strike, not an attack, just a piece of cloth. And then he steps back, basically saying, I had the chance to end you, Saul, but I didn't. It's such a small action, but it's huge in meaning. It's symbolic. David could have killed Saul, but he chooses not to because of something bigger, his respect for God's anointed. Even though Saul is unworthy in his actions, even though Saul's been disobedient and dangerous, David recognizes that the position itself is sacred. That is the principle that runs through both chapters, 24 and 26. God has appointed authority, and it's not up to you to overstep that appointment. It's not personal, it's divine order. And you know what's fascinating, Saul notices. He sees that a part of his garment is missing, and he has this realization that he's like, wow, David had a chance to kill me, and he didn't. And he acknowledges it, saying, basically, you're more righteous than I am, which is wild because you can imagine the tension in that cave. But David doesn't just stop at letting Saul live. He also calls out Saul afterward, showing him the piece of the garment as proof. It's like David saying, I could have harmed you, but I chose to respect God's will. It's a very deliberate act of restraint and moral clarity, and it sets the tone for how David handles Saul moving forward. Now, fast forward to chapter 26, and we see a very similar situation, but with some added layers of complexity. The Ziphites, a group of locals, go to Saul and basically tattle on David. They're like, hey, Saul, David's hiding in the wilderness of Ziph. And of course, Saul, being Saul, doesn't just send a few men, he brings 3,000 soldiers. And it's like, wait, really? 3,000 for one guy? That's classic Saul. Right overkill, driven by paranoia, driven by obsession. Meanwhile, David, again, is aware that Saul is hunting him, and he's watching the movements, sending out spies to understand the situation fully. He's being cautious, strategic, but still. Here's the key: he sees an opportunity. David identifies where Saul is camped, and, as usual, he could strike. And this is where Abishai comes in. Abishai, David's nephew, is, well, let's just say he's a hothead. He's zealous, impulsive, and incredibly loyal to David. He's the kind of guy who, if given the chance, will leap into danger without much thought. And when David says, "Who will go with me into Saul's camp?" Abishai jumps at the opportunity immediately. He's ready to take Saul down. He's like, just point me in the direction. Uncle David, I won't miss. And you can almost feel the adrenaline in this moment. Right. It's tense. Dangerous. The stakes couldn't be higher. David's life and the lives of his men are all hanging in the balance. So they sneak in under the cover of night. Saul is sleeping, surrounded by his soldiers, and his spear is literally near his head. David and Abishai could end it right there. But David does the same thing he did in chapter 24. He chooses restraint. He takes the spear and the jug of water small. Symbolic items as evidence that he's been there. But he doesn't harm Saul. And this is the crux of the principle. David recognizes that it's not his place to kill God's anointed. The position matters, even if the person occupying it is corrupt or morally unfit. And that's such a hard lesson, right? Because naturally, human nature leans towards self-preservation and revenge. If someone has been hunting you for years, the first instinct is, end them now. But David chooses a higher principle. He trusts that God will handle the situation in God's timing. And then comes the follow-up. David positions himself at a distance and calls out to Abner, Saul's commander. He's careful, measured, and direct. He basically calls out, hey, Abner, are you not a man? Why weren't you guarding the king properly? It's not just a taunt, it's a lesson. David is showing that, even when respecting authority, accountability still matters. Abner responds a little confused, asking who David is calling out to, and David explains, making it clear that he had the chance to act violently, but he chose not to. He points to the spear and the jug of water as proof. It's an amazing scene, full of tension, yet it also communicates this layered message: you can oppose wrongdoing without breaking moral boundaries. And then Saul himself wakes up. He hears David's voice and is startled, maybe a little shaken. David speaks to him, not with aggression, but with reason and careful explanation. He says, essentially, look, I could have harmed you, but I didn't. I won't harm you. Your life is precious, and God's timing will deal with the outcome. Saul, predictably, has a mixed reaction. He's terrified, embarrassed, and for a moment, he admits his guilt, saying, I have sinned. Don't harm me anymore. And David responds with grace, returning the spear, acknowledging the Lord's hand and letting Saul go. It's tense, dramatic, and yet profoundly human. It's a mix of fear, respect, moral restraint, and divine trust. Now, when you look at these two chapters together, you see a pattern. David repeatedly chooses restraint over vengeance. He respects the authority of God's anointed, even when the person is unworthy. He trusts that God will handle justice in God's timing. And this is such a striking principle because it contrasts so sharply with human nature. Most of us, if we were in David's shoes, would probably act out of anger or fear, right? We see wrong, we feel justified, and we often jump straight to retaliation. David, however, models a different approach. He tempers action with patience, moral clarity, and respect for divine authority. And there's a cultural parallel here that's worth mentioning. Even today, in modern contexts, we often struggle with this principle. Think about bosses we don't like, leaders we disagree with, politicians we're frustrated by. There's a tendency to think, I don't respect them, so I don't have to obey them, or I can act against them because I'm right. But the story of David and Saul teaches that respecting positions of authority even when the person is flawed is crucial. It doesn't mean condoning bad behavior. It doesn't mean turning a blind eye to injustice. But it does mean understanding that some authority is God ordained, and it's not ours to override. There's wisdom in restraint, patience, and moral integrity, even in difficult circumstances. Back to the narrative, David's restraint also shows his self-control and strategic thinking. He's not impulsive, he's not motivated purely by emotion. He sees the bigger picture. He knows that acting violently against Saul could compromise his own position, his moral standing, and his long-term goals. By sparing Saul, he maintains his integrity and preserves his future as a leader. And this is key because leadership isn't just about winning battles or asserting dominance. It's about timing, integrity, and wisdom. David consistently demonstrates that he understands this, even when fear, anger, and opportunity are all pulling him in another direction. And then there's Abishai, who adds this interesting dynamic. He's impulsive, zealous, and loyal to a fault. His eagerness to act highlights the tension between raw human instinct and the higher principle that David adheres to. David has to manage not just his own emotions, but also the impulses of his men. He has to channel their energy and zeal in a way that aligns with moral and divine principles. This is leadership in action. It's not glamorous or flashy, but it's incredibly nuanced. He's balancing human emotions, moral restraint, and trust in divine timing, all under extreme pressure. When you put these chapters side by side, it's almost like a replay with variations. Chapter 24 gives us the cave scenario opportunity, restraint, symbolic action. Chapter 26 gives us the camp scenario opportunity, restraint, direct confrontation, and communication. And each time, the principle is the same: respect God's anointed, act with moral clarity, and trust that justice will unfold in its own time. And honestly, it's a principle that applies beyond biblical stories. It's a lesson in human behavior, leadership, patience, and trust in a higher order. It challenges the instinct to act impulsively and shows that sometimes the hardest, most powerful choice is the one you don't make immediately. And there's a bit of irony here too, right? Saul is obsessed with hunting David, thinking he's the ultimate threat, but he's blind to his own moral and spiritual decline. He's unworthy of his position in many ways, yet David still respects it. That contrast really drives home the principle of respecting positions of authority even when the person is flawed. It's about understanding divine structure, not personal sentiment. And it's honestly a hard lesson. Humans naturally judge, react, and take shortcuts when emotions run high. David's actions teach restraint, foresight, and trust in God's overarching plan. It's subtle but incredibly profound. And there's also this ongoing theme about timing. David understands that God's justice and plan operate on a different timeline than human impulsiveness. He doesn't try to force outcomes. He doesn't get impatient or vengeful. Even when Abishai is ready to strike, David reminds him that timing and moral integrity matter more than immediate satisfaction. This is a leadership lesson that's timeless. It's about strategic patience, not passivity. It's about acting in alignment with values, not just reacting to circumstances. And it's honestly remarkable to see it played out so vividly in these chapters. And, there's also a very human element in all of this. David is tired, scared, and constantly under threat. He's dealing with the exhaustion of running for his life, the stress of leading a small army, and the moral burden of making life and death decisions. Yet, he consistently chooses restraint, integrity, and respect for God's authority. That combination of human vulnerability and moral strength is what makes these chapters so engaging. It's easy to relate to David's fear and fatigue, but also to admire his discipline and wisdom. It's not a perfect hero story, it's raw, human, and nuanced. And you can't ignore the tension in these narratives either. The night raids, the sneaking into enemy camps, the high-stakes choices, all of it makes for intense storytelling. It's dramatic, but it's also deeply instructive. Each scenario is a chance for David to demonstrate moral clarity, strategic thinking, and respect for authority. And the outcomes reinforce that his restraint and faith are ultimately rewarded. He doesn't take Saul's life. He maintains his own moral high ground, and God's plan continues to unfold. It's a narrative that balances tension, human emotion, and spiritual principles seamlessly. In both chapters, the phrase, "the Lord's anointed," comes up repeatedly. And that's crucial. It's not just a title, it's a reminder that authority, even when wielded poorly, has a sacred dimension. David understands that over and over again. He doesn't get personal with Saul. He doesn't act out of revenge. He recognizes the position, acknowledges God's authority in appointing it, and restrains his actions accordingly. It's subtle, but it's central to the lessons of these chapters. And again, think about modern parallels. Even today, we're faced with authority figures who may be flawed, unjust, or unworthy, and the instinct is often to bypass respect or act impulsively. But the story of David teaches a different approach. Respect the office, act with integrity, and trust that justice and consequences will be handled appropriately. It's about moral restraint, strategic thinking, and a recognition of a higher order, principles that are remarkably relevant even thousands of years later. So, to sum up, chapters 24 and 26 are really about restraint, moral clarity, and respect for authority. David is on the run, constantly threatened by Saul, yet he repeatedly chooses not to act violently even when he has the chance. He demonstrates that respecting God's anointed is about honoring the office, not the person. He models patience, discipline, and strategic thinking, all while managing the impulses of his zealous followers like Abishai. And honestly, it's a lesson about human nature as much as it is about divine principle, restraint in the face of provocation, patience in the face of threat, and wisdom in the face of opportunity. These stories are tense, human, and full of insight, showing how one person can navigate danger, moral complexity, and divine timing all at once. Alright, so now we're diving into chapters 27 and 28, and man, this is a really heavy part of David's story. Imagine being hunted for 10 years, 10 whole years of looking over your shoulder, of never knowing when the next attack might come, never feeling fully safe. That kind of pressure, it doesn't just wear on your body, it gets into your mind, your spirit, your emotions, and David's been living in that constant tension with his small army of loyal men. You can't even imagine how exhausting that would be. Day after day, week after week, month after month, and all the while trying to protect your men, their families, and yourself. It's relentless. By chapter 27, David's weariness has reached a point where he's thinking pragmatically, okay, I might actually perish someday by Saul's hand. There's no way around it. And here's the thing, he's not just talking about himself. He's thinking about what's best to preserve the lives of the 600 men who follow him and their families. Desperation and fear start creeping in, subtly at first, but then they begin to shape decisions. David realizes that if he retreats to Philistine territory, maybe Saul will give up chasing him. The irony is, it's not Saul who's in despair, it's David. The very person who should be confident in God's plan is thinking the safest option is to go live among his nation's enemies. That's human though, right? When we're at the end of our rope, we make choices we wouldn't normally consider. So, David decides to take 600 of his men, and remember, these aren't just soldiers, they're men with families, and those families are coming with them to the land of Achish, the king of Gath. Achish is also known by the title Abimelech, which translates to my father is king, a title more than a personal name. But the guy is a Philistine king, an enemy of Israel. And here's the thing, David had actually been in Philistine territory before, back in chapter 21, and he had to pretend to be insane just to get out safely. Achish had realized then that David could be trouble, but now, 10 years later, David returns with 600 men and all their families. It's not a small move, it's a full relocation, and it highlights how desperation affects not just the person making the decision, but everyone depending on them. Despair has ripple effects. David approaches Achish humbly, asking not to live in the royal city, but in a safer, quieter place. And Achish grants him Ziklag. Ziklag, literally. Winding or twisting is going to be David's base for the next 16 months. 16 months out of God's direct plan, in enemy territory. And here's the point, even though it seems safe, it's spiritually and morally a dangerous place. David's not among his own people, and his presence there is already bending the rules of loyalty and obedience. Fear and discouragement are influencing him, and we start to see that decisions made in desperation can subtly and sometimes dramatically shift someone off the path they were meant to follow. While in Ziklag, David and his men begin raiding neighboring territories, the Geshurites, the Gersites, the Amalekites. Now, on the surface, it's like, okay, he's attacking enemies of Israel, so maybe it seems justified, but the key is the motivation. He's doing it partly to survive, partly to maintain favor with Achish, and partly because the pressure and discouragement of constant pursuit have skewed his judgment. He's taking plunder and reporting back to Achish, presenting himself as a loyal servant to the Philistine king. And that's a really important point. Despair can lead us to serve the wrong people. David's not acting maliciously, but he's compromising. He's serving someone he shouldn't, engaging in violence he wouldn't normally consider, and that's the subtle danger of despair. It reshapes priorities, blurs ethical boundaries, and pushes even the strongest individuals into morally complex and sometimes wrong decisions. David rationalizes these raids by saying he's not harming his own people. He's attacking outsiders, so in his mind, it's okay. But look closer, he's fully aware that his loyalty should be to Israel, to God's people. This is where we see the human element of moral compromise under stress. When we're worn down and tired, fear and discouragement cloud judgment. Even good, capable people can start doing things they normally wouldn't, simply because the immediate pressure is so intense. And it's important to notice how the narrative shows the ripple effect his men and their families are along for the ride. They're participating in these raids, being affected by decisions that are, let's be honest, not God-directed. Despair doesn't just impact the person experiencing it, it spreads. And that's a really human and relatable point. How often do our own stress and discouragement affect those around us? Sometimes without us even realizing it. And then we hit chapter 28 and things get darker. The Philistines gather for war, and Saul, who spent so much time obsessing over David, suddenly faces a real external threat. He's afraid, and his fear overwhelms him. He seeks the Lord for guidance, but nothing comes, no dreams, no prophets, no Urim. He's essentially spiritually cut off, and that desperation leads him to a decision that's honestly pretty shocking. He seeks out a medium, someone he had previously outlawed and expelled from the land, to conjure guidance from the dead. That's right, fear and despair push Saul to violate his own laws, to reach for forbidden practices because he's afraid and feels powerless. And that's tragic. It's a stark illustration of how despair can override judgment, even in a king who should know better. So Saul disguises himself. He's trying to be careful, right? Avoid being recognized, avoid getting into trouble with the medium, and avoid passing through enemy territory visibly. And he goes to Endor, asking the medium to summon Samuel, the prophet who has died. Now, this is where things get intense. The medium sees Samuel and is shocked. Scholars debate whether it's really Samuel or a demonic impersonation, but the point of the story is clear. Saul is in a place of complete desperation and spiritual disconnection, and the consequences are immediate and severe. He's told that he and his sons will die, and that Israel will fall to the Philistines. That's it. His fear-driven decisions have led to this tragic prophecy. And the text shows that despair doesn't just affect immediate choices, it can steer us into catastrophic outcomes. And here's the thing, the contrast between David and Saul is so striking. David, in Ziklag, is compromised, yes, but he still maintains some moral restraint. He doesn't attack his own people. He keeps some ethical boundaries, even as his decisions are influenced by fear and exhaustion. Saul, on the other hand, has allowed fear and despair to completely override moral and spiritual guidance, leading him to desperate and destructive actions. Both stories highlight the very human effects of prolonged stress, discouragement, and fear. Even the strongest, most chosen people can make questionable or dangerous decisions when weariness and despair take hold. Also, it's worth pointing out the lesson about leadership. David's choices in Ziklag affected hundreds of people, his men and their families. That's a huge responsibility, and his weariness made the consequences of each decision much more severe. Saul's despair affected an entire army and the fate of Israel in battle. Emotional and spiritual states have a profound impact on those we lead, whether we're thinking about individuals, families, or entire nations. Despair spreads, and when it leads to poor decisions, the results are magnified. There's another subtle lesson here about how despair can reshape morality and priorities. David is rationalizing his actions. He's attacking enemies of Israel, serving the Philistine king, keeping his family and men safe. He's making the best of a bad situation, but his judgment is compromised. Saul's decisions are worse. He seeks forbidden guidance, ignoring the laws he once enforced because fear has completely taken over. Both stories show how despair can distort decision-making, warp moral reasoning, and push even strong leaders off course. And yet, even in the midst of this, there's a human, relatable element. David is exhausted, scared, and protecting others. Saul is terrified and desperate, trying to find answers where none come. Both are responding to pressure in very human ways, and that's what makes these chapters so compelling. They're not just historical accounts, they're deep dives into human nature under extreme stress, the moral complexity of survival, and the spiritual consequences of fear-driven decisions. So, to sum up chapters 27 and 28, here's what we see. 10 years of being hunted wears on David, leading him to make difficult, morally complex decisions, including serving the Philistines and raiding enemies. Despair and discouragement can make even strong, chosen people do things they wouldn't normally do, affecting everyone around them. Saul, on the other hand, allows fear to completely override judgment, ultimately turning to forbidden practices and receiving a tragic prophecy of death. Both stories emphasize the weight of prolonged stress, the ripple effects of despair, and the importance of maintaining moral and spiritual clarity even when life feels impossible. These chapters remind us that exhaustion and discouragement are powerful forces, and they shape choices in ways that can be subtle or catastrophic, affecting not just the individual, but everyone they lead or influence. Alright, so let's talk about Hebrews 12, 1-3, and why it's such a powerful encouragement, especially when life feels heavy. You know, the passage starts by talking about being surrounded by this huge cloud of witnesses. Think of it like a cheering squad, but not the cheesy kind. They're people from the Faith Hall of Fame, heroes who ran their races, some through real pain, some through incredible trials, and they made it. And the idea is, okay, if they can do it, we can too. It's not pressure, it's inspiration. It's like saying, hey, you're not alone in this. Others have faced challenges that probably made them want to give up, but they kept going. Then it talks about laying aside every weight, every sin, everything that slows you down. And you know, that's something we all get, right? Life piles on things, distractions, bad habits, regrets, worries, and we carry them around like a backpack full of rocks. The author of Hebrews is basically saying, take a moment, let some of that go. You don't need to hold on to everything at once, especially the stuff that's just weighing you down. Imagine trying to run a marathon with a backpack full of stones. You could do it, maybe, but it'd be miserable and slow. So, lay down what you can, focus on what matters. And here's the kicker, it says we're supposed to run with endurance the race that's set before us. Not just sprinting, not comparing ourselves to the person next to us. Because trust me, Someone else's race looks different from yours. Life's got its own course for each of us. Running with endurance means pacing yourself, staying steady even when it gets hard, and not quitting just because it's tough. You know those moments when everything feels like it's against you. That's when endurance kicks in. You don't stop, you just keep moving, one step at a time. And then, the passage says, keep your eyes on Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. That's such a good reminder. Look, it's easy to get caught up in all the chaos around us, failures, fears, what other people are doing, what's going wrong in the world, and lose track of the bigger picture. Keeping your eyes on Jesus is like using a GPS. You might stumble, you might wander, but as long as you're looking at him, you'll find the right direction. It's not about ignoring reality or pretending life isn't hard. It's about not letting the hard things define you. Focus on the one who knows the finish line and has already run the race for you. Now, think about this. Jesus endured the cross, despising the shame, and sat down at the right hand of God. That's not just some abstract spiritual point, it's real suffering. He faced hostility, ridicule, the ultimate injustice, and yet, he endured for the joy set before him. That's the kind of endurance Hebrews is pointing us toward. We're encouraged not because life is easy, but because we can look at his example and see what perseverance looks like. Even under unimaginable pressure, he had a goal, a joy on the other side of the pain, and that kept him going. And here's a human example that really hits home for me, Corrie ten Boom. If you don't know her story, she was a prisoner in Nazi Germany. Her family died in the camps, but she survived. And after all that trauma, she reflected on the secret to enduring suffering. She said something like, look within and be depressed. Look without and be distressed. Look at Jesus and be at rest. Isn't that amazing? She doesn't sugarcoat it. Life is harsh. Things are terrible. People get hurt. We face real despair, but keeping your focus on Jesus provides a calm center. A kind of peace that doesn't ignore reality, but gives you strength to keep going. That's endurance in action. It's real, it's gritty, and it's human. You know, it's funny because sometimes we think endurance is about pushing through by sheer willpower. But Hebrews is pointing out that it's relational, not just physical. It's relational looking to Jesus, letting his example inspire you, letting his strength guide you. We're not doing it alone. The cloud of witnesses is there, the Spirit is there, and Jesus is there. That's a profound thing when you feel like you're on your own, right? When discouragement is knocking and you think, I can't handle another day, remember this, Jesus has already endured far more, and he's running with you, and honestly, it's okay to be real about how tough it gets. That's why the writer says, consider him who endured such hostility from sinners. Don't ignore the hostility, the suffering, the pressure. It was real. He was human. He felt pain. He experienced rejection. So when we feel weary, discouraged, or tempted to quit, we're not weak for feeling it. We're human, but the encouragement is in the response. Look at Jesus, see the finish line. Remember that he endured and overcame. And the message is, you can too. Not by pretending the struggle doesn't exist, but by focusing on the one who has already navigated the worst of it. And let's keep it real, discouragement is sneaky. It creeps in slowly, often disguised as practical thinking or realism. You start to believe you're alone, or that the burdens are too much, or that the race is unfair. And yeah, life is messy, and sometimes unfair, and the obstacles seem insurmountable, but that's exactly when these verses hit hardest. They remind us to adjust our perspective, refocus, and remember who's in charge. When we fix our eyes on Jesus, discouragement loses a lot of its power. It doesn't vanish, but it doesn't get the final say either. So, what does this look like in everyday life? Well, maybe you're in a tough season. Work is overwhelming, relationships are strained, health is fragile, finances are tight, the clouds of witnesses are real. Two people who have endured trials. People whose stories inspire and remind you that survival, growth, and triumph are possible. and you lay aside the weights, you can letting go of guilt, of regrets, of toxic habits, and you take the next step. One day at a time. One choice at a time. That's running the race with endurance. And it's not just about surviving, it's about thriving in the midst of the struggle. Keeping eyes on Jesus, like Corrie ten Boom did, changes the way you experience hardship. You're not numb to the pain. You're not ignoring reality. You're choosing where to focus, and that focus brings strength. It gives perspective. You start to see that the race is not about avoiding every hardship, but about keeping faith and endurance through it. And yes, it's messy, it's exhausting, it's human, but it's also profoundly hopeful. Hebrews 12, 1-3 is reminding us that endurance isn't just brute strength, it's spiritual alignment, focus, and perspective. It's seeing the finish line through the lens of Jesus' life and sacrifice. It's considering that he faced hostility, pain, and suffering, yet remained steadfast. And we can draw strength from that. And yes, we stumble, we falter, we get discouraged, but the call is to keep looking at him, to keep moving forward, and to let his example guide us. It's practical, it's real, and it's human. So as you think about your own race, your own struggles, remember the encouragement laid down what weighs you down. Run the race with endurance. Keep your eyes on Jesus, and don't let discouragement make the final call. And when you need perspective, think of people like Corrie ten Boom, real people, real suffering, real hope. Let that inspire you, remind you, and guide you through the tough parts of your race. The finish line is there, and you're not running alone, okay? So chapter 28 is, wow, it's intense. And honestly, it's one of those moments in the Bible that really makes you stop and go, whoa. Saul, after years of being tormented and hunted, finds himself in a really desperate place. The Philistines are gathering their armies, and Israel is looking at a major confrontation. And Saul, he's afraid, like truly trembling in his heart. This is the king who spent so much energy chasing David for a decade, and now he's looking at a threat that's way beyond his personal vendettas, right? This is the real enemy, the Philistine army, and it shakes him to his core. But here's the thing, Saul, even though he's the king and God's anointed, he's in a bad place spiritually. He's gotten so desperate that he decides he needs some guidance from a medium. Wait, a medium? Yeah, the irony is brutal because, remember, at some point, Saul had outlawed all mediums and spiritists from Israel. He did the right thing, initially cutting out the occult, clearing the land of these practices because God had made it very clear in Deuteronomy 18 and Leviticus 19 that consulting the dead or trying to channel spirits was an abomination. No messing around with that stuff. But here he is, desperate, scared, probably panicking, and he thinks, maybe this will give me some answers. So Saul asks his servants if there's a medium who can perform a seance, and they tell him, okay, there's a woman at Endor. Endor is just a few miles north, but it's through enemy territory, so he can't just casually stroll over. Now here's where it gets really human and kind of tragic. Saul puts on a disguise. Can you picture this? The king of Israel, over 6 feet tall, probably towering over everyone, putting on different clothes, trying not to be recognized, sneaking past Philistine territory at night. You almost want to laugh, but also it's sad because it shows the desperation and the fear that drives him. So he sneaks up to the woman and he's careful. He swears to her by the Lord, like, don't worry, no harm will come to you for doing this. And he tells her to bring up Samuel, the prophet who had died. And at this point, pause for a second, this is wild. He's literally asking someone to contact the dead. The Bible doesn't make this casual, it's serious stuff. And the woman is understandably freaked out too. She says, wait a second, haven't you cut off all mediums and spiritists? Why are you putting me in danger? And she's scared, right? Because technically, if she's caught, she could have been punished for this. Now, Saul instructs her specifically to conjure up Samuel, and here's where it gets super eerie. The woman sees Samuel and cries out loudly, like she's terrified, completely shocked, and she realizes, oh my gosh, this is the king. She hadn't recognized him because of the disguise. And Saul, well, he's clearly unsettled. Samuel appears, and the conversation that follows is heavy. Samuel asks Saul why he's disturbed him by calling him up. Saul explains, "I'm deeply distressed. The Philistines are about to fight us, and God isn't answering me no dreams, no prophets, nothing. So he says, I've called you to find out what I should do. Now here's the crazy part, Samuel. Through whatever means, tell Saul exactly what's going to happen." He says, "Look, the Lord has departed from you. You're not going to win this. You and your sons are going to die, and Israel is going to fall into the hands of the Philistines." That's just brutal. And if you think about it, it's kind of heartbreaking because this is Saul's last opportunity. He's getting the final word from a prophet he trusted, but he's waited too long, and now the consequences are set. And here's where it gets really interesting and a bit complicated. Theologians and scholars debate what actually happened here. Was it truly the spirit of Samuel, or was it a demonic entity mimicking Samuel now? Normally, when people try to contact the dead, that's exactly what happens. The Bible warns repeatedly about familiar spirits and mediums. They're deceptive, manipulative, and dangerous. But the text suggests this instance might have been different. The woman is genuinely shocked and amazed, not just tricked, and Samuel delivers accurate prophecy that comes to pass. It's unique, a one-time intervention from God to confront Saul and deliver a final message. So whether you lean one way or the other, the key takeaway is that this was serious, supernatural, and God-controlled, not just a casual spiritual trick. Now, let's step back for a second and just think about Saul. This is a man who had once been anointed by God, a king, chosen, set apart. But over time, his fear, his disobedience, his impatience, and his desire to control outcomes led him to this point. He's desperate enough to go against his own laws and conscience, putting his life at risk, sneaking around at night, and consulting the dead. It's tragic. And honestly, it's relatable on a human level, right? How often do we try to take shortcuts or seek answers from the wrong sources? When fear or desperation takes over, Saul's story is extreme, but the principle hits close to home. So the seance happens. The woman describes a spirit ascending from the earth, an old man covered with a mantle like the traditional prophet's shawl, and Saul recognizes him as Samuel. He bows down in awe and fear. And Samuel delivers the prophecy again. The kingdom has been torn from Saul's hand and given to David because of Saul's disobedience and failure to execute God's command against Amalek. He warns of the coming defeat and that he and his sons will die the next day. It's like a punch to the gut. Right? Saul has seen the future. It's unavoidable. And now he knows it. And the aftermath heartbreaking. Saul falls full length on the ground, overwhelmed with fear. He's exhausted. He hasn't eaten. He's emotionally shattered. The woman, ever the practical one, prepares some food, a fatted calf, unleavened bread to restore his strength. She's trying to help, but Saul initially refuses. Eventually, he eats, but you can feel the weight of doom pressing down. This is the king at the absolute lowest point, emotionally, spiritually, and physically. It's a tragic end, but also a sobering example of what happens when fear, disobedience, and poor decisions compound over time. And think about this in everyday terms. We often try to find answers in the wrong places when we're desperate. We look for quick fixes, we seek advice from sources we shouldn't trust, or we just panic and act out of fear. Saul's life is a stark reminder that desperation can lead us to dangerous decisions. He was once aligned with God, anointed, set apart, and now he's consulting the dead to get clarity. It's extreme, but it's a lesson we can all relate to. We have to guard our decisions, even in fear. We have to rely on God's guidance and his timing, not our own desperate measures. And the Bible makes a point to emphasize the danger of the occult here. Deuteronomy 18 and Leviticus 19 make it clear mediums, spiritists, those who attempt to call up the dead, these practices are forbidden. They're dangerous, deceptive, and not from God. Saul's consultation of the medium is a direct violation of what God commanded, even if he's acting out of fear. And that's a lesson that carries forward today. Anytime we try to manipulate spiritual forces outside God's guidance, it's risky, it's deceptive, and it can bring harm. Saul's story shows us that clearly, but here's the nuance: this particular event was allowed by God as a one-time intervention. Samuel appears, delivers prophecy, and confronts Saul. That's different from the typical danger of mediums or spiritists, which usually involve deception or demonic influence. So God used a unique, miraculous moment to deliver a final warning. And it's sobering because it underscores both his justice and his patience. Even at this point, God communicates, even when Saul has drifted far. But Saul's choices and his long pattern of disobedience have led him to a place where the outcome is fixed, and you can almost feel the tension in the story. Saul is trembling, confused, scared, and yet he had made his own decisions for years. He ignored God's commands, chased David obsessively, and now he's facing the ultimate consequence. There's a human element here too: fear, desperation, shame, and realization all mixed together. And the medium, though fearful, is part of the story, obedient to Saul, doing what she's asked, but even she can't change the outcome. It's a sobering reminder that our choices matter, and that living outside God's guidance has consequences. Now, as you think about this, there's a practical application for us. Fear and desperation can cloud judgment. They can push us toward decisions we wouldn't normally make, towards sources of guidance that are harmful or even dangerous. Saul's story is extreme, but we see it in smaller ways all the time, looking for quick solutions, making rash decisions, ignoring principles we know are right because we feel cornered. And the Bible, through this story, warns us to rely on God's guidance, even when we're afraid, and to resist shortcuts or forbidden practices, even when they promise answers. And the tragedy isn't just about Saul's death or defeat. It's about the spiritual and emotional spiral that got him there. Years of fear, obsession, and disobedience led him to this desperate act, and the weight of consequence is heavy. It's a cautionary tale, but it's also strangely a story of God's continued presence and warning. Even at the edge, God allows a last word, a final confrontation, and the prophecy Samuel delivers is precise, accurate, and unavoidable. Saul can't escape it. That's both awe-inspiring and sobering. So as you read chapter 28, it's hard not to feel a mix of emotions: shock, fear, awe, and maybe a little sadness. You see the consequences of choices compounded over time. You see the danger of looking for answers in the wrong places. You see the unique way God can intervene even in desperate situations, but also how human choices determine outcomes. And you see a man, the King of Israel, stripped of options, facing the weight of his own decisions. It's raw, it's human, it's cautionary, and it's a powerful reminder for all of us about fear, obedience, and the dangers of desperation. So yeah, chapter 28 is heavy. Saul consulting the medium at Endor, his disguise, the seance, the appearance of Samuel, it's all dramatic and cautionary. And through it all, we see God's control, his justice, and the consequences of a life that drifts from his guidance. It's tragic, it's sobering, and it's relatable in the ways that fear and desperation can make us act irrationally, even dangerously. And the end, Saul eats, rises, and leaves. But the weight of doom hangs over him. The Philistines, the prophecy, the loss, it's all coming, and there's nothing he can do to change it. It's heavy stuff. But man, it's powerful storytelling and a reminder for us to stay aligned with God, even when fear is pressing in. Okay, so let's just talk about something that's super important, and honestly, it's kind of easy to gloss over until you see what can happen. I'm talking about seances, Ouija boards, tarot cards, psychic reading, stuff like that. And yeah, I get it. Some people think, oh, it's just for fun, or hey, it's harmless. Right, but the Bible is really clear about this kind of thing, and honestly, the story of Saul in chapter 28 is a perfect example of the dangers. So, picture this Saul, who is already in a bad spot, desperate and scared, decides he needs guidance from a medium. Now, remember, he had outlawed mediums and spiritists from Israel. He knew God said not to mess with the dead, not to consult those who claim to channel spirits or predict the future through forbidden practices. Yet here he is, disguised, sneaking through enemy territory, trying to get answers from a woman who taps into the spirit world. And this is after he spent years chasing David, completely consumed by fear and obsession. So, right away, we can see how desperation can make us do things we wouldn't normally consider. And that's the first thing: fear and desperation make us vulnerable. Now, the woman at Endor, she's a medium, right? And she's understandably freaked out when Saul asks her to conjure up Samuel. She's like, wait a minute, you outlawed this stuff, and now I could be in huge trouble for even doing it. That fear is real. And Saul thinks he's getting some secret knowledge or an advantage. But here's the catch most of the time. When people try to contact the dead or tap into occult practices, they're not connecting with anyone good. Usually, it's deception, sometimes even demonic. Those so-called spirits aren't helpful. They're dangerous, misleading, and can mess with your mind and your life in ways you don't even realize at first. And here's where I need to be really honest. This stuff isn't a game, even if it looks fun, or like a party trick, or just a way to peek behind the curtain. There's a spiritual cost. Scripture warns against it. Deuteronomy 18, Leviticus 19. God is super clear. Mediums, spiritists, those who try to call up the dead or predict the future through these methods, that's considered an abomination. Why? Because it opens you up to influences that are not from God, and often those influences are harmful. They don't care about you. They don't care about your intentions. They're just looking for access, for a foothold, and can lead you into lies and danger. And let's bring it back to Saul again. He thought, okay, I'll get answers. I'll find some guidance. But look what happened. He's already spiritually weak, emotionally raw, and desperate. By going to the medium, he's putting himself directly in a vulnerable position. Even though in this one unique instance, God allowed Samuel to appear. That's not the norm. And that's important. This wasn't a typical encounter with a medium. It was God's intervention to confront Saul. Normally, this stuff is deceptive. You think you're talking to a loved one, or getting insight, or fun guidance. But really, it's a doorway to something dangerous. That's the principle we need to take seriously. So, practical examples today. Look around. People use tarot cards thinking it's just entertainment, or Ouija boards, maybe at a sleepover, just for laughs, maybe psychic readings, or trying to connect with a deceased loved one. It can feel harmless, even comforting, but the Bible calls it what it is: involvement with unfruitful works of darkness. Ephesians 5:11 tells us to have no fellowship with these things, but rather expose them. They're not neutral, even if you think, oh, it's just a game, or I'm in control. You're opening the door for influences that are not from God. And that can have real-life consequences: mental, emotional, spiritual, sometimes even physical consequences. And honestly, some of the stories you hear are wild. People get convinced that spirits are speaking through them, giving advice, revealing secrets. And it's easy to be fooled because these forces can mimic things we know or love: familiar spirits, as the Bible calls them. But here's the kicker: they're not trustworthy. They have no interest in your good. They want to deceive, confuse, manipulate, sometimes even scare you into obedience to them rather than God. And think about Saul. He was already on edge. He's fearing the Philistines, fearing David, and now he's trying to cheat God's plan with a shortcut. It's desperate, it's reckless, and it's a cautionary tale for all of us. I mean, let's be real. Sometimes we're curious, right? We're looking for answers, comfort, maybe even a thrill. And there's a cultural side too: movies, TV, pop culture. All this stuff glamorizes the supernatural, the spooky, the occult, and that makes it seem harmless, fun, or even mystical. But Saul shows us that the line between curiosity and danger can be razor thin. Once you start dabbling, even out of fear or just wanting answers, it can spiral, and the spiritual risks are real. So what do we do instead? Well, the Bible is full of alternatives: prayer, scripture, seeking God's wisdom through His Word, community, godly counsel. Those are the safe, life-giving ways to seek guidance. When Saul tried to skip those, it led him straight into fear, despair, and ultimately disaster. There's no magic shortcut. God's ways are always the safe ways, even when the answers seem delayed, even when the future looks uncertain. Staying grounded in God's word and guidance is the key. And here's a small human reflection. It's easy to rationalize these things. You might think, oh, I'm just curious. It's not a big deal. Or I just want to know something about my future. I've heard it a million times. People say, oh, the cards are just fun. It doesn't really mean anything. But again, the principle is there. We're opening doors that God doesn't want open. And even curiosity, unchecked, can lead to danger. That's why Saul's story hits so hard. It's an extreme example, but it's a perfect illustration. One decision made out of fear and desperation, and you're stepping into a place that can't be controlled by human hands. And here's the takeaway: avoid it. Guard your heart, guard your mind. God's word warns. God's story shows the consequences. Saul's life is an extreme warning, but the message is simple. Don't dabble in occult practices, seances, Ouija boards, tarot cards, trying to communicate with the dead. They're not toys. They're dangerous. They can deceive you, influence you, and lead you far from God's guidance. And even if it seems harmless, the spiritual stakes are real. We've seen that in history. We see it in scripture, and we can see it in lives today. So yeah, casual curiosity can be deadly if it leads you to the occult, and it doesn't take years of running from enemies to fall into danger. It can happen in a moment of fear, in a moment of desperation, or even just because it seems fun. That's why Ephesians 5:11 is so clear. Have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather expose them. Don't just ignore it or think, oh, that doesn't apply to me. It does. And guarding your spiritual life means saying no to these practices every time. And if you need encouragement, remember, God is accessible. He wants to guide you, and He doesn't require tricks or shortcuts. Prayer works. Reading scripture works. Seeking wise counsel works. Unlike the occult, it's trustworthy, life-giving, and aligned with God's plan. You don't have to seek answers from places that could deceive or destroy you. God's guidance is always the safe and right path. And Saul's story shows the consequences when we ignore that, even for a king. So yeah, bottom line, if you have Ouija boards, tarot cards, or any kind of occult items around, get rid of them. Seriously, don't let curiosity or desperation put you in the same trap Saul fell into. Guard your life. Guard your heart and rely on God's wisdom, not forbidden practices. And the really sad part about Saul is even though he had a direct warning, he was too far gone in his choices to recover. Don't let curiosity, fear, or desperation take you there. Keep it simple. Keep it safe and always stay close to God. There's guidance, there's wisdom, and there's peace, but it's only through Him, never through the occult. Alright, so as we wrap up, take a moment to just reflect on this. Patience really matters. Endurance pays off, and staying spiritually aware can protect you in ways you might not even notice. Life can get messy, but keeping your eyes on what's true and walking with wisdom really makes a difference. And hey, if you found this story helpful or inspiring, consider hitting like or subscribing. It helps us share more content like this. But mostly, just keep steady. Stay thoughtful and stay resilient.